This year's been a whirlwind of DIY and crafting projects. But before 2023 is officially over, I wanted to share my top 20 projects of the past year. This list was created based on your feedback throughout the year. You also let me know about a couple projects that flopped. So a special thank you to all my viewers who take the time to comment on my videos. To keep this video from being overly long, I excluded large room makeovers and any project that was holiday specific. I hope you'll enjoy this compilation, and I hope you'll let me know if your favorite project made the list. So, let's get started. Let's start with the best use of a picture frame. I love the short story, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, but this project can be adapted to any story you like. Just find related images online that can be uploaded into the Cricut design space to create silhouettes that will fit inside your picture frame. After weeding out the black vinyl, I applied clear transfer paper to the creepy tree and adhered half of it along the right-hand edge of the glass and cut off the other half and set it aside. Next, I applied clear transfer paper to the horseman and adhered him under the tree. Then I applied the remaining half of the tree to the left edge of the glass. To create a subtle textural background, I tore a sheet from a thrifted pad of art paper and used glue stick on the cardboard back of the frame to adhere the art paper. Then I cut off the excess paper along the edges. Next, I uploaded a vintage image of the first page of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow into the Print to Size app. This allowed me to adjust the size of the poem to fit perfectly between the vinyl silhouettes. I used a metal ruler to tear evenly along the poem edges and then applied glue stick on the back side to adhere it to the art paper, making sure that it was centered between the two creepy trees. In this next picture frame project, I combined the frame with an inexpensive thrift store clock. First, I unscrewed and removed the clock face, and then I hammered out the two small wood brackets that the face had been attached to. I found a pretty frame in my stash that was already missing its glass and back. I decided to use my jigsaw to cut the clock opening to the same size as the inner part of the frame. Unfortunately, due to the side details on the clock, I wasn't able to cut out an opening as neatly as I would have liked. Next, I gave the clock a couple coats of an off-white chalk paint. And to get into all the nooks and crannies, I spray painted the picture frame with some white Zinsser primer. Even though the frame was plastic, I used my brad nailer to attach it to the front of the clock. Then I painted the frame with the same off-white chalk paint to match the clock. And when the paint was dry, I distressed the clock and the frame with some sandpaper. And then I applied a coat of clear wax to seal and protect the paint. Now to add something inside the clock. This clock is fairly deep and would have had room to hold a small live potted plant, which I think would look adorable. But since I'll probably sell this, I decided to add faux greenery. I hot glued some styrofoam to the base and then stuck in some faux vines. I used some floral pins to attach a bird's nest to the styrofoam and then hot glued a ceramic bird inside the nest. Then I hot glued some sheet moss to cover the styrofoam. This clock was missing its back when I bought it, so I printed out a pretty landscape image on cardstock and attached it to a piece of cardboard with spray adhesive. I cut the cardboard to fit exactly into the opening on the back of the clock, so I was able to just pop it in and use the existing tabs to hold it in place. I love how this turned out. I may have to keep this one for myself. And now for the best spindle project. I used a large spindle that had previously been used to create a candle stand. First, I hammered off the broken top piece and then pulled out the nails that had held it in place. I set my miter saw to a 30-degree angle and sliced off the top few inches of the candle stand. The wood split just a bit, but it won't be noticeable once I'm done. Next, I removed the hardware from an old cabinet door that I bought at the Habitat Restore for $1. I marked the center of the back side and sanded a spot where I would attach the candle stand. Before putting the two parts together, I went ahead and filled the screw holes with some wood filler. I also cut a scrap piece of trim to fit across the bottom of the door. This would create a ledge to keep the book from sliding off. To create better adhesion, I lightly sanded both pieces where they would be joined together and then adhered them with wood glue and a few brad nails. I added wood glue to the angle cut on the candle stand and placed it on the center of the back side of the door, and then I added one brad nail from the back side to hold it in place so that I could flip the door over and add additional brad nails from the top side. After the wood glue was fully dry, I gave the door a medium sanding, removing the top layer of stain, but not sanding down to the bare wood. I just wanted the wood to have some grip so that I could re-stain it. I liked the dark wood of the candle stand and wanted to replicate that, so I brushed some black latex paint on the door and then immediately wiped it off. Next, I applied a coat of dark walnut stain, and I let that soak into the door for about 5 minutes before wiping away the excess. It dried lighter than I hoped, but no one will notice once a book is lying there. For the next spindle project, I attempted to replicate this garden totem that sells for $800 on the Mackenzie Childs website. In addition to a spindle, I also located a variety of wood containers in my stash. I created the base using 3 boxes turned upside down. The largest one was an old photo organizer whose lid was originally hinged on. I added an extra piece of plywood to fill in and reinforce its bottom. Then I used Gorilla Glue to attach all 3 boxes together. I then attached an old table spindle to the top box to give the tower a little more height. And finally, I attached a ceramic rabbit to the top of the spindle. I let the Gorilla Glue dry overnight. The next day, I sprayed the entire piece with a coat of Zinsser primer. Once the primer was dry, I ran a bead of caulk in the seams between each of the boxes, the spindle, and the rabbit. This would give it a unified appearance and add to its durability. To add some decorative interest, I drilled a small hole in the corner of one of the boxes, added Gorilla Glue, and inserted a piece of thrift store metal wall art into the hole. I arranged the metal branches to help hold it in place. Then I painted the entire piece with a couple coats of leafy green spray paint. I thought the bottom two boxes were looking a little plain, so I used some super glue to attach some Dollar Tree wood cutouts. Then I painted the cutouts with the same green spray paint. To imitate the Mackenzie Child's totem pole, I should have used antiquing wax, but I chose to use white wax instead because I just really love the look of white wax on green paint. I frequently repurpose old jewelry boxes. This one received a lot of positive viewer feedback. Some of you will probably think that I should have left the natural wood, but I really thought a little paint would give it an updated look. Before painting, I removed the storage components, the glass panes from the doors, and the door hardware. I debated removing the mirrors and decided to leave them. Then I painted it with 2 coats of celery green chalk paint. I didn't remove the door hinges because I prefer to paint over the hinges and make them disappear anyway. While the paint was drying, I began working on some flowers to put inside the jewelry box. I had thrifted this odd floral a few years ago and was never quite sure what to do with it. The base resembled a piece of bark with some moss and a small bird nest attached. The flowers and greenery were looking really sad, so I removed most of them and added some new stems to the base. I reassembled the jewelry box, lightly distressed it with some sandpaper, and applied a coat of clear wax to seal the chalk paint. Then I just sat my floral arrangement inside to use the jewelry box as a vintage-looking terrarium. I think this project that combines a cutting board and wood salad bowl was one of my more unique ideas this year. You'll need some way to cut your bowl in half. I used a table saw. I sanded 1/2 all the way down to its natural wood and left 1/2 stained. To make it seem like that the bowl is an organic part of the cutting board, I decided to round off the bottom corners of the cutting board to the shape of the bowl. I traced around the curves of the bowl onto the cutting board and then used my jigsaw to cut along the line. Then I went over the cut edge with my orbital sander to smooth everything down. I needed to cut down the stained half to a smaller size to fit a more narrow cutting board that I had picked up at HomeGoods on clearance for just $4.99. And then I rounded the bottom corners of that cutting board too. First, I used wood glue to attach the edge of the bowl to the bottom of the cutting board, and I let that glue dry for about 10 or 15 minutes before I came back with my brad nailer to nail the bowl in place. I love upcycling thrift store lamps, and this easy DIY project was quite popular with viewers. I found this gold and glass lamp at the thrift store for about $12. To remove the gold design, I applied Goof Off, letting it soften the paint for a few minutes, and then scraped it off with the razor blade. This technique always works for me on glass and occasionally on ceramics when the paint was applied after the ceramic piece was fired. If you can feel the texture of the paint with your hand, then you should be able to scrape it off. I found a thrifted wood round in my stash that was the perfect size to create a base for my cloche lamp. For this next lamp project, I disassembled a thrift store wall sconce. I'll link the full tutorial in the description box. Just know that taking apart a lamp is actually much easier than you think. I didn't know if this was going to work or not, but I wanted to attach the light fixture to the front of an old dictionary. I opened the book to its center and laid it face down with half of the pages spread out on each side. I chose a drill bit the same size as the sconce arm and drilled a hole through the center of the book spine, making sure it came through the center of the pages on the back side too. At this point, I ran the cord through the drilled hole, but you'll see that I ended up removing it so that it was easier to attach the sconce arm. I cut and tore out several pages from the book's center to make room for the cord and for the nut. I knew I didn't want to use the large metal wall plaque, and I also decided just to use the decorative metal washer and not the wood round. On the front side of the spine, I hot glued the decorative metal washer to the book. Then I pushed the sconce arm through the washer and through the drilled hole until the threaded end poked through the back side of the book. The nut that came with the sconce was extra wide, so I found a sturdy but smaller nut to use to attach the sconce arm. This would hold the arm upright and also allow the book to be fully closed. I ran the cord through the arm and then returned all of the other lamp parts in the correct order. Although I would have liked to have left some of these decorative pieces off, they have to be used because the top section of the arm is the exact length needed for the socket base to screw tightly onto the threaded end of the arm and hold everything snugly in place. Once the socket base was screwed on tightly, I wrapped the wire ends back around the screws and tightened them. To get the socket back in the base, pull on the opposite end of the cord, then replace the insulation sleeve and the socket shell. You'll need to push on the shell until it pops into the base. I think some of my best DIYs are those that use free materials. For this project, I wanted to see if I could make a lantern using sticks from my yard. I cut 4 large sticks to the same length and 8 medium sticks to the same length. I found a square piece of wood in my scrap wood pile, and I began hot gluing the ends of each of the 4 large sticks to that piece of wood. After gluing on each individual stick, I turned the wood over and added a brad nail through the bottom to help hold the sticks in place. Next, I used my outdoor pruners to cut 4 of the medium-sized sticks to fit the sides of the piece of scrap wood. I attached them using hot glue, and then I added 1 brad nail in the center of the stick. Next, I glued a stick at the top and between two of the large sticks on the right-hand side, and then glued another stick between the two large sticks on the left-hand side. Then I glued a stick to the top of the two large front sticks and another stick to the top of the two back sticks, cutting the sticks with my pruners to fit as I went along. I added a nail in each of the four corners to help those last two sticks stay in place. Then I cut 4 very skinny sticks and glued one in each of the four corners, and then gathered the opposite ends together in the center to create a little roof for the lantern. Next, I hot glued sheet moss in any spot where 2 sticks came together. This not only concealed the joint, but it also added extra reinforcement. To decorate the lantern, I added a bird's nest, some faux greenery, and a small butterfly. I tried to avoid including holiday DIYs in today's list of top 20 projects, but viewers really enjoyed this spring wreath, and I felt it wasn't too Easter specific. I started with a thrift store grapevine wreath, tucking in all the loose strands of grapevine. Then I began using some very sturdy florist wire to attach styrofoam eggs to the wreath. I found a couple faux stems in my stash that were a green color that I thought coordinated well with the color of the Easter eggs. I cut it apart into small pieces and then added those pieces to the grapevine wreath. I had ordered a variety pack of feathers from Amazon very cheaply, and I decided that the black and white speckled ones coordinated the best with my wreath, and I began sticking those feathers into the grapevine. Many of the feathers were quite small, so I added some additional greenery vines to help fill in empty areas. I was also able to wrap some of this around the loose pieces of grapevine and have a few pieces drooping off the bottom edge of the wreath. The best furniture flip of the year was a $35 thrift store dresser with a broken front foot. I devoted an entire video to this project, so if you missed it, you might want to go back and see exactly how I created a custom mold to replicate the existing front foot so that I could repair the broken one. Then I removed and disassembled the drawers and repurposed the wood to create a middle divider and shelves where the drawers had once been. Once the construction part was done, I painted the furniture piece with a light blue acrylic enamel paint to coordinate with the William Morris wallpaper I had ordered. I applied the wallpaper to the top of the dresser and to the front of the 2 remaining drawers. I refinished the drawer hardware, and then finally I styled the cabinet with some of my favorite kitchen decor. This garland was one of my most popular spring projects of the year. I started with some scrap wood pieces, which I cut into rectangles 2 inches wide by 3 inches long. Then I printed out several different vintage seed packet images on regular copy paper in sizes to fit on the wood rectangles. To adhere the images to the wood, I applied a light, even coat of Mod Podge both to the piece of wood and to the back of the piece of paper, smoothing out any wrinkles with my fingers and a paper towel. When the Mod Podge was dry, I used a utility knife to cut off any extra paper around the edges and sanded all the edges with 220 grit sandpaper. Then I applied a top coat of Mod Podge and let that dry. Once the second coat was dry, I drilled a small hole in the top center of each block of wood and screwed in a small eye hook. These seed packets are cute on their own, but now let's string them on a piece of twine and combine them with some vintage wood spools. I placed one spool on either side of my 7 seed packet blocks. I decided that I would tie the wood blocks to the twine to keep them from sliding around. Because I wanted a simple, rustic look, I ripped a couple strips of fabric off of an old sheet and stuck them in my morning cup of coffee. I let them soak for about 15 minutes and then wrung them out and let them dry. Once they were dry, I cut them into smaller strips and ran them through the eye hooks and tightened them around the twine. I thought the spools looked a little plain, so I cut a few small pieces of ribbon and hot glued them around each spool. And now for one of the biggest flops of the year. I had this idea of creating a piece of butterfly wall art that would look like a plaster relief, where the image is raised rather than an impression. I hot glued 3 Dollar Tree butterflies to an old sign and then covered them with joint compound. Unfortunately, I had to apply a lot of joint compound to cover the burlap texture of the butterflies. As a result, the relief was not as raised as I had hoped. I thought they might be more prominent if I applied antiquing wax, but that just made it even worse. Look at this hot mess. I'm embarrassed. I honestly can't believe that I did not edit this out of the video. However, I still think this could work and turn out really neat, but the butterflies need to be plastic or cardboard, not fabric. In one video this year, I let several people select incredibly ugly items from the thrift store that I had to transform into something I would put in my own home. One of those items was this large wall spoon. To begin, I removed the nuts holding the spoon in the frame, and then I painted the frame with green chalk paint. When the paint was dry, I lightly distressed the edges and applied some clear wax. Next, I traced around the frame and cut out a large section from an old poster that I had ordered from Amazon and never used. I applied a good quality glue stick to the back of the poster and then pressed it into the frame, smoothing out any wrinkles. I could have stopped there, but you know I didn't. I had a piece of what might be petrified wood in my stash. I cut off a small piece on my miter saw and glued it inside the frame. Next, I drilled a hole in the center of the piece of wood to have a place to add some fern stems. I felt that I would somehow be cheating if I didn't use the fake spoon in a project too. So I started off by giving it a couple coats of light gray chalk paint. And then I found an oval frame in my stash that was just slightly larger than the end of the spoon, and I painted its frame with the same light gray chalk paint. When the paint was dry, I lightly distressed both the spoon and the frame with some 220 grit sandpaper, and then I applied a coat of white wax, carefully dabbing away the excess. At first, I wasn't sure what I wanted to put in the frame, but I ended up choosing a piece of leftover wallpaper because I loved the way the colors coordinated with the gray paint. To attach the frame to the spoon, I drilled a small hole through the spoon and then screwed through the spoon and into the back of the wood frame. I wanted this to look less like a spoon and more like an ornate frame. So I cut a few floral stems and some faux greenery and wired them together and then wired them to the spoon handle just above the picture frame. Based on viewer comments, this pumpkin project was by far everyone's favorite use of fabric this year. I just ripped off the orange burlap fabric from a Dollar Tree pumpkin and then wrapped it in my piece of needlepoint. I used a small metal spatula, also from the Dollar Tree, to press the needlepoint fabric into the creases of the styrofoam. And because the fabric was stiff, I did have to cut a few slits to get it to lay flat, but I didn't have to use any hot glue. That is, until I wrapped the pumpkin with some pieces of burlap ribbon. I went around the pumpkin 3 times with the burlap ribbon, hot gluing the ends on the bottom of the pumpkin. Then I wrapped some pink thread around a vintage spool and hot glued that to the top of the pumpkin for a stem. Next, I hot glued on a leaf and a vine to make it look more pumpkin-y. And to finish it off, I hot glued a fake bird to the fake vine and took the end of the thread and hot glued it into the bird's beak. I happened to see a package of some tiny pearls on the shelf, so I just went ahead and hot glued a couple of those to the vine and the leaf too. Although I do like the pumpkin, the no-sew pleated lampshades were my favorite fabric project this year. I started with 2 white drum shades and 2.5 yards of lightweight cotton fabric. I folded the fabric over on itself so that I could cut out 2 layers at one time to speed up the process a little bit. First, I cut the fabric to 11.5 inches tall, the same height as the drum shade. Then I cut that piece of fabric into 2-inch strips. I used about 75 strips per lamp. I also cut 2 long strips to go around the top and bottom edges of the lampshade. Next, I ironed each strip, folding the sides over to the back. Then I hot glued each strip to the top and bottom edge of the lampshade. I just barely overlapped the strips along the bottom edge, but I overlapped them much more tightly along the top edge. Once I made my way around the shade and it was completely covered, I trimmed off any threads or extra fabric that was extending beyond the edge. Then I hot glued the long folded strip of fabric around the top and bottom edges of the shade. And now for another project that flopped. I had this pretty black pattern napkin that I wanted to try using in a reverse decoupage project. The plan was to decoupage the napkin face down on the outside of a thrift store vase so you could see the pretty pattern on the inside. However, I made two mistakes. First, I needed to use a plate, a bowl, or a vase with a large opening so you could actually see more of the napkin. Secondly, I painted over the backside of the napkin with black paint, which darkened the flowers and leaves, making them almost disappear. I really needed to use white paint. I think I could have first painted the napkin white and then painted it black or another color. I still think it turned out pretty, but it was a lot of work for a very subtle effect. If the vase was a decoupage don't, then this lamp project is a decoupage do. I even surprised myself with the transformation of this polka dot thrift store lamp. It took 2 coats of my favorite Zinsser primer to cover up those polka dots. Once the primer was dry, I taped off the lamp and spray painted the bottom portion with some vintage gold spray paint. To cover the body of the lamp, I separated the plies from some blue and white napkins that I had, setting aside the top patterned ply. And then I cut that piece into smaller sections. To apply the napkin to the lamp, I brushed Mod Podge in small areas and then pressed the napkin pieces into the Mod Podge and carefully smoothed out the wrinkles, going over the top of the napkin with a little more Mod Podge. Use a light hand so that you don't tear the delicate napkin, but it actually is more forgiving than you would think. And just accept the fact that you're going to have some small wrinkles, but they will be barely noticeable once the Mod Podge dries. I used 2 larger pieces of napkin, one at the top and one at the bottom of the lamp, and then just filled in any empty areas with small designs cut from the napkins. Once the Mod Podge was dry, I applied some antiquing wax to the gold paint at the base of the lamp to give it some depth and make it look a little bit more like real metal. I brushed on the wax and then dabbed off the excess with a paper towel. For a final protective layer, I sprayed the lamp with 2 coats of a clear top coat. I think this is a really good before and after, if I do say so myself. I do like using lamps in projects, but I love using clocks. And when I saw this thrift store clock with extra storage inside, I thought it might make an interesting book nook. I began by removing the door and all the little hardware. I also removed the metal covering because it was already falling off. I removed the clock mechanism and debated whether I was going to use that hole as a window to see into my book nook. I used a razor blade scraper to remove all of the dried glue that had once held that metal covering, and then I began wallpapering the inside of the clock using some scrapbook paper. Because the scrap paper that I used was pretty thick, I adhered it using glue stick because if I'd used Mod Podge, it was likely to bubble. Once the inside of the clock was completely wallpapered, then I began to work on the outside. I needed to cover up those areas where I had removed that metal covering. I decided it would be appropriate to decoupage those areas with pages taken from a vintage book. And because this paper was thin, I adhered it with Mod Podge. I applied a thin, even coat of Mod Podge to the clock and to the back of the paper, and then carefully smoothed out any wrinkles. I let the Mod Podge completely dry, and then I came back and cleaned up the edges using 220 grit sandpaper. And finally, I applied a top coat of Mod Podge over the book paper to seal and protect it. I'll link the full tutorial if you'd like to see how I made many of the accessories that I put inside the book nook, including the rug, the plants, and the tiny books. I saved what was clearly this year's most popular upcycling project for last, the grandfather clock. I found it on the curb in my neighborhood. It was really dirty, but otherwise in good condition. The first thing that I wanted to do was to see if I could remove the pendulum. Luckily, I discovered that the clock, pendulum, and chime were all operated by 3 separate battery boxes. This was especially good news because if for some reason the clock didn't work, I could easily fix it with a new battery box. I cleaned the clock really well with liquid sandpaper, which helps to remove some of the sheen so that the paint will stick better. Then I painted that cherry-stained wood with a shellac primer, which is the best primer to use to stop dark wood stain from bleeding through your paint. Once the primer was dry, I applied 2 coats of an acrylic enamel paint, which has a very durable finish. The gold clock face was pretty, but the other gold accents looked cheap, so I brushed some gold rub and buff over them to give them a more authentic brass appearance. I also used my finger to apply rub and buff to highlight some of the decorative wood trim. I applied a piece of peel and stick wallpaper to the back wall of the cabinet. I chose a simple gold pattern that complemented the gold clock face. I had been studying the box-shaped base below the pendulum cabinet, and I was certain it was hollow inside. So I decided to open it up using my favorite demo tool, a rubber mallet. Then I used some pliers and a screwdriver to help me remove any of the remaining small pieces. Once I had my mess cleaned up, I painted the inside of the opening with 2 coats of my blue acrylic enamel paint. The pendulum cabinet is the perfect size for a small bookcase. So I measured and cut a piece of pine wood to create 3 shelves, and then I gave them a couple coats of the blue paint. After measuring and marking the locations for each shelf, I made sure the shelves were level from end to end and from front to back before nailing them in place. If you want to try this project for yourself, I recommend you watch the full tutorial for tips and tricks on how to attach the shelves, even if you don't have a nail gun. You'll also see how I repurposed the clock pendulum, weights, and chain. All right, I narrowed it down to 20. Now please let me know in the comments, which project do you vote for number 1 of 2023?